Welcome to This Explainer. I am so incredibly excited to take you through today's topic because, honestly, it completely flips the script on everything we think we know about human history. Right now, if you were to pour yourself a glass of wine or crack open a cold beer, you probably wouldn't give it a second thought. You'd just drink it and go about your day. But what you are actually doing is participating in one of the absolute oldest activities a human being can do. It's an activity that's older than writing, and incredibly, it's even older than farming. In fact, it predates human beings entirely. Today we're going to look at how alcohol didn't just casually join civilization. It might have actually built the whole thing.
So I want to pose this question directly to you. When do you think ancient humans actually started drinking? What's the real starting point here? Because if you're picturing a bunch of ancient farmers a few thousand years ago stumbling into the invention of wine, or, setting up the very first ancient brewery after they'd already built a village, you kind of need to adjust your timeline. We need to go much, much further back in time. We aren't looking for the first human brewery. We are looking for the very first biological impulse.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our relationship with alcohol actually starts about 10 million years ago. Imagine a forest floor in Africa. A piece of fruit falls from a tree and sits on the ground for just a little too long. The natural sugars inside that fruit start breaking down, wild yeast gets in, and bam, a natural fermentation process begins. This fruit starts producing very small amounts of ethanol. Now picture a small primate, our ancient ancestor, picking up that overripe fruit. They eat it, and the ethanol inside makes them feel just a little bit drunk. They had absolutely no idea what was happening chemically, but it felt good, so they kept coming back for more.
And that brings us to a fascinating concept introduced by UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley in his 2014 book. It's called the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument is remarkably simple but really profound. Over millions of years, our ancestors didn't merely tolerate this accidental alcohol, they actually evolved to actively look for it. The rewarding feeling of consuming that ethanol-rich, fermented fruit became a biological drive. So by the time ancient humans actually arrived on the evolutionary scene, this taste for alcohol was already hardwired right into our biology. It was just sitting there, a built-in desire, long before anyone ever figured out how to manufacture a drink on purpose.
So when did we finally figure out how to make it on purpose? To answer that, we have to fast forward to an incredible archaeological discovery made back in 2018 at a place called Rockafit Cave near Haifa, Israel. About 13,000 years ago, a nomadic group of people known as the Natufians used this cave. Well, when archaeologists excavated the site, they found these stone mortars that were carved directly into the solid bedrock of the cave. And when they analyzed the microscopic residue left inside those stone mortars, they found traces of wheat and barley. But this wasn't just raw grain. It had been deliberately soaked, germinated, and left to ferment. The Natufians were quite literally brewing beer in a cave 13 millennia ago.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive paradigm shift in how we understand human history. The old story, the one you probably learned in school, goes something like this. Humans settled down, they figured out agriculture and farming, they built villages, and then eventually they discovered fermentation and invented alcohol. In that version, alcohol was just a byproduct of civilization. But the Rockafit Cave discovery completely flips that script. The Natufians were not farmers. They hadn't even invented agriculture yet. They were still hunting animals and gathering wild grain by hand. They didn't grow the barley, they foraged for it. Yet somehow, the desire to make beer was so strong that they figured out how to brew it while they were still completely nomadic.
Let's move along and see how this builds into something even more monumental. About 1,000 years after the Natufians, so around 12,000 years ago, someone built something absolutely enormous in southeastern Turkey at a site called Göbekli Tepe. This is a massive, deliberate, and incredibly complex architectural structure. It's made of giant stone pillars arranged in these careful circles, and they're carved with intricate images of animals. And here is the real kicker. This was built before farming, before pottery, and before anyone in this region had a permanent home. These people were still hunter-gatherers.
To really understand the scale here, look at this number, 10 tons. That is how much some of these carefully carved stone pillars weighed. For years, archaeologists were completely baffled. Why would nomadic people organize the massive amount of labor required to drag 10-ton stones up a hill and carve them with such precision? Like, what on earth would motivate hunter-gatherers to do this? Well, the answer came when they found large stone vats at the site. Chemical testing on the insides of these vats revealed traces of fermented grain. They were brewing at Göbekli Tepe. And not just a little bit, they were brewing enough for massive gatherings. This entire complex wasn't a home, it was a gathering place for ritual feasting and communal drinking.
Which brings us to this revolutionary theory by Patrick McGovern. He's an archaeobotanist and arguably the leading expert on ancient alcohol in the world. He spent decades looking at this evidence and argues this: humans didn't start farming to make bread. They started farming to make beer. It is a stunning thought, isn't it? If he is right, the intense desire to drink, that biological impulse passed down from the drunken monkey, is what actually motivated hunter-gatherers to finally settle down and figure out how to domesticate grain.
So the crucial point here is really the simplicity of alcohol compared to food. Think about what it takes to make bread for a second. It is a highly complex, labor-intensive process. You gotta grind the grain into flour, knead it into dough, bake it in an oven. It's a lot of work. But consider the steps for making beer. Step 1, soak grain in water. Step 2, leave it alone. The fermentation happens completely by itself. The desire to achieve that rewarding, intoxicating feeling would have been a vastly stronger motivator for early humans than simply eating grain in a slightly different baked form. Alcohol might literally be the very reason we settled down to farm in the first place.
Now, let's fast forward about 9,000 years to 7,000 BCE. We are moving from the Middle East to a Neolithic village called Jihu in central China. By this time, humanity has actually settled down, and the archaeological evidence for brewing goes from basic fermented grain to something incredibly precise and intentional. We find these pottery jars in this village that tell a very specific story about just how advanced our relationship with alcohol had become.
Inside those pottery jars, archaeologists found the residue of the oldest confirmed recipe for alcohol anywhere in the world. And look at these ingredients: rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn berries. This wasn't some crude accidental sludge at the bottom of a vat. No way. This was a sophisticated, deliberate blend. Multiple ingredients were carefully chosen, measured, and combined to create a specific flavor profile and fermentation result. Whoever was brewing this drink in Jihu village 7,000 years ago knew exactly what they were doing. Brewing had officially become an art and a science.
From there, the human obsession with alcohol only exploded. By the time we reach ancient Egypt, roughly 5,000 years ago, beer had completely transcended being just a fun beverage for feasts. It became the absolute bedrock of their society. It was fundamentally woven into the survival, the daily life, and the very economy of the entire civilization. Ancient Egypt didn't just drink beer, they ran on it.
To give you an idea of just how essential it was, let's talk about the workers who built the pyramids. These laborers were out there dragging massive limestone blocks in the brutal, unrelenting desert heat. And they weren't paid in bags of coins or sacks of raw grain. Nope. Their actual daily salary was 4 to 5 liters of beer. I mean, if you're working in the blistering sun all day, 5 liters of cold beer definitely sounds a lot more appealing than heavy metal coins.
Now, what's really interesting here is exactly why beer was so heavily utilized. It wasn't just a way to get a buzz, it was a literal multi-tool for survival. Yes, it functioned as a daily salary, but it was also a vital water filter. Water from the Nile was often contaminated, but the brewing process made beer safe and clean to drink. It also served as a high-calorie meal, providing essential energy and nutrients for those exhausted laborers. Doctors even used it as medicine, mixing herbs into beer to treat everything from stomach aches to infections. And finally, it was a religious offering, believed to be a divine gift created by the god Osiris. One single cup of beer did the job of a paycheck, a water filter, a hearty meal, a medicine, and a prayer. Talk about a multitasker.
So, let's take a step back and look at the grand timeline we've explored today. 10 million years ago, a biological impulse is born when a primate eats fermented fruit on a forest floor. 13,000 years ago, that same impulse drives nomadic humans to brew in stone mortars in Rakafet Cave before they even know how to farm. 12,000 years ago, they're organizing massive labor at Göbekli Tepe, quite possibly building the very first monuments in human history just to have a communal place to drink. 9,000 years ago, they are perfecting sophisticated recipes in China, and by 5,000 years ago, entire empires like Egypt are using it as the economic foundation of their society.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. Did alcohol build the world we live in? The evidence we've looked at today strongly suggests that alcohol didn't just come along after we built civilization. It might be the very reason we built it at all. The process has changed, the recipes have gotten way better, and the cups are certainly much fancier today. But the impulse remains exactly the same. So the next time you raise a glass, remember, you are continuing a 10 million-year-old tradition that quite literally